In the winter of 1771, Boston was a colonial port city of roughly 16,000 souls, pressed between the harbor and a landscape still shaped more by nature than by ambition. It was not yet the city of revolution that memory would claim, though tension moved quietly through its streets. The town occupied a narrow peninsula connected to the mainland by a single neck of land, a geography that made it both defensible and vulnerable, isolated and essential. Boston mattered because it was where ideas, goods, and grievances converged, where the machinery of empire met the resistance of those it sought to control. The streets were not straight. They followed old cattle paths and the contours of three hills that rose from the peninsula, their names already embedded in the life of the town. Copp's Hill to the north, Beacon Hill at the center, and Fort Hill overlooking the waterfront to the south. These hills shaped movement and visibility. From their slopes, you could see across the rooftops to the harbor, where masts rose in clusters and the water reflected the gray winter light. The air smelled of wood smoke, salt, and the sharper odors of tanneries and slaughterhouses that operated near the edges of settlement. Snow turned to mud quickly in the narrow lanes, mixing with horse droppings and the refuse that accumulated despite efforts to keep the town passable. Most buildings stood 2 or 3 stories tall, constructed of wood with steep gabled roofs designed to shed snow and rain. Clapboard siding, often left unpainted or weathered to a silver gray, covered the frames. Brick structures existed but remained the exception, reserved for the homes of merchants, public buildings, and a few churches that punctuated the skyline. Windows were small, their glass expensive and often imperfect, rippling the view of the world outside. Shutters could be closed against the cold, and at night the town grew dark except for the occasional lantern hung by a doorway or carried along the street. There was no organized lighting, no system to hold back the winter night. The waterfront defined the town's purpose. Long Wharf extended more than 2,000 feet into the harbor, the longest such structure in North America, wide enough for carts and warehouses and the constant traffic of goods moving between ship and shore. Smaller wharves jutted out alongside it, each owned by a merchant or consortium, each crowded with barrels, crates, and the apparatus of trade. Ships arrived carrying manufactured goods from England, textiles, tools, ceramics, tea. They departed loaded with timber, dried fish, whale oil, and the products of a landscape still rich in resources. The work was loud and physical. Longshoremen hauled cargo under the watch of ship captains and clerks who tallied every item against invoices written in careful script. The cold made the work harder. Hands grew stiff. Rope burned even through gloves. Ice formed along the pilings when the wind came off the water. Away from the docks, the town's layout revealed its social order. The wealthiest families lived near the center and along the better streets, their homes larger and set back from the road, often surrounded by gardens or small orchards that would bloom in spring. Merchants, lawyers, and officials occupied these spaces, their parlors furnished with imported chairs, their walls hung with portraits painted in England or by local artists attempting the same style. Servants moved through these houses, most of them young women from the countryside or the families of laborers, their presence so common it was rarely remarked upon. Enslaved people also lived and worked in Boston, their numbers smaller than in southern colonies, but their labor no less essential to the households and businesses that relied upon them. Artisans and shopkeepers lived closer to their work. A silversmith kept his shop on the ground floor of his home, the forge glowing in the back room while his family occupied the floors above. A printer operated his press in a space that smelled of ink and damp paper, the rhythm of the machine marking the hours. Tailors, coopers, ropemakers, and blacksmiths worked in similar arrangements. Their skills passed from master to apprentice in a system that structured much of the town's economy. Boys as young as 12 or 13 lived with masters, learning trades that would define their futures. The work was precise and demanding. A mistake could ruin materials that had been expensive to acquire. Taverns served as more than places to drink. They were centers of information and debate, where men gathered to hear news from other colonies, to argue over taxes and the presence of British soldiers, to conduct business over mugs of rum or ale. The Green Dragon, the Bunch of Grapes, and others like them filled with voices in the evening, the warmth of their fires drawing people in from the cold. Women rarely entered these spaces, their social world more constrained, centered in homes and churches and the networks of family and neighborhood. Yet they managed households that functioned as small economies, preserving food, making cloth, raising children, and maintaining the domestic order that allowed everything else to proceed. Churches held authority that extended beyond worship. The Old South Meeting House, the Old North Church, and others served as gathering places for town meetings, where decisions were made collectively, argued over, and sometimes bitterly contested. Religion shaped daily life in ways both visible and invisible. The Sabbath was enforced. Shops closed. Work ceased. Attendance at services was expected, and absence noted. Yet by 1771, the old Puritan strictness had softened. Anglicans, Baptists, and others had established their own congregations, and the town accommodated a diversity of belief that would have been unthinkable a century earlier. The presence of British soldiers complicated everything. They had been stationed in Boston since 1768, ostensibly to keep order but experienced by many as an occupation. The red coats of the regulars were visible throughout the town, in the streets, at the docks, quartered in buildings that had been requisitioned for military use. Tensions ran beneath the surface of daily interactions. Soldiers competed with local workers for jobs. They frequented taverns where their presence was resented. Fights broke out, usually small and quickly ended, but the potential for larger violence was understood by everyone. The Boston Massacre had occurred just a year earlier, in March of 1770, when soldiers fired into a crowd, killing 5 men. The memory was fresh. Trust was scarce. Winter made everything harder. Food supplies depended on what had been preserved from the previous harvest and what could be brought in by ship or overland before the roads became impassable. Root cellars held turnips, carrots, potatoes, apples kept in barrels, salted meat and fish, grain for bread. Firewood was essential, and its cost rose as the season deepened. Those without sufficient fuel suffered, huddled in unheated rooms, wearing every piece of clothing they owned. Illness moved through the population predictably. Smallpox outbreaks had ravaged the town in previous decades, and though inoculation was becoming more accepted, it remained controversial and expensive. Consumption, fevers, and the ordinary ailments of crowded living took their toll, especially among children and the elderly. Education existed for those who could afford it or access it. Boston Latin School prepared boys for college, teaching them Latin, Greek, mathematics, and rhetoric in classrooms heated by single stoves that barely warmed the farthest benches. Younger children attended dame schools, small informal operations run by women in their homes, where basic literacy and arithmetic were taught. Books were precious. A family might own a Bible, an almanac, perhaps a volume of sermons or poetry. Newspapers circulated among multiple readers, passed from hand to hand until the paper grew soft and torn. Information traveled slowly, but when it arrived it was consumed with attention. The common served as open space at the edge of the settled area, used for grazing livestock and military drills. It was not yet the park it would become, just rough pasture enclosed by fences, crossed by paths worn into the earth. From there, you could look back toward the town and see the density of it. The roofs overlapping, smoke rising from hundreds of chimneys, the steeples marking the churches that organized both space and time. Beyond the common, the countryside opened up, fields and forests stretching toward towns like Cambridge and Roxbury, connected by roads that turned to mud in spring and froze hard in winter. Boston in 1771 was a place shaped by its position between worlds. It was colonial but not provincial, connected to London by ships that crossed the Atlantic in weeks, carrying not just goods but ideas, orders, and the weight of an empire that was beginning to fracture. The people who lived there were subjects of the British Crown, yet many had begun to imagine something different, though what that might be remained unclear. The vocabulary of rights and representation was being spoken aloud in taverns and meeting houses, printed in newspapers, debated in conversations that would have consequences no one could fully predict. Daily life continued alongside these larger currents. Bread was baked. Children were taught. Ships were loaded and unloaded. The rhythms of work and worship and the changing seasons provided structure and continuity. Yet beneath the surface, the pressure was building. The taxes that had provoked outrage, the soldiers who remained as a visible reminder of authority, the growing sense among many colonists that their interests and those of the empire were no longer aligned. All of this simmered quietly, waiting for the spark that would bring it into the open. To walk through Boston in 1771 would have been to move through a world both familiar and utterly strange. The scale was smaller, the pace slower, the smells and sounds different from anything we know. Yet the concerns that occupied people then, security, prosperity, fairness, the desire to shape their own futures, these remain recognizable. The town was not yet the birthplace of revolution, but it was becoming the place where the ideas and grievances that would fuel revolution were gathering force. Looking back across more than 250 years, it is difficult not to wonder what it felt like to live in that moment, when the future was uncertain and the past still exerted its hold, when the routines of daily life continued even as the ground beneath them was shifting. The physical place has changed beyond recognition, but the questions that people asked then about power and justice and belonging are still being asked today. If you have thoughts about what life might have been like in colonial Boston, or questions about details not covered here, feel free to share them in the comments.